Hi everyone, I'm Elizabeth Wright and this is your video for Introduction to Biology. So a little bit of background on me. I did my bachelor's degree at UC Davis and then I did a PhD in biochemistry at UC Riverside. And once I finished my PhD, I only applied for postdoctoral research positions in Europe because I really wanted to go have some fun. So I ended up living for 3 years in London doing work at University College London, and I was doing cancer research there. And I had a great time. I tell the students every day, you should get your education and let it take you places, because I wouldn't trade those 3 years in London for anything. So how did I get to Athenian? Well, airplanes, believe it or not. So my dad lived nearby and he's a good friend with Marsh Freeman, who started the airplane project. So my dad and Marsh were over here building airplanes all the time. And Bruce Hamrin would come down to the airplane barn that used to be down by the middle school, and they were chatting, and Bruce was talking about airplanes, and he was a science teacher, and my dad says, oh yeah, well, my daughter teaches science. And so sure enough, eventually I ended up here teaching science too. So this first picture you can see is a snap from the newspaper and is the first Spirit of Athenian airplane, and that's my dad flying it for the first time. This is another picture of a different airplane that he built in our garage. My poor mother never got to park a car in the garage. There was always an airplane being built in my garage. So let's go through a little bit of the curriculum that we are going to go through this year. The first semester is really tough. We started off by learning about how to define life, because biology is the study of life, so it's good to know what we are considering to be alive. Right now we're in the middle of our macromolecule unit, which the kids are usually kind of a little frustrated with because they feel like they took chemistry last year and why are they still having to do chemistry this year? Well, we have to learn about the biological molecules that make up cells. Then we're going to learn all of the parts of the cell, followed by a unit on the role of membranes in protecting the cell and the cell organelles. We will then get to a very, very difficult unit on metabolism and how cells make energy. This hits around November, and if your student is telling you, oh, it's so hard, they're right. It's really, really difficult. We finished the first semester with a unit on DNA replication, and to be honest, it's still very, very challenging. The second semester tends to be a little easier for a lot of students to understand. We start off with a unit on cell division, and then we move to inheritance, and students tend to love that unit. Following March term and spring break, we do a unit on plants and their structure, plant evolution, and finally we end the year with ecology. So how do we learn? Well, even though we're online, this is still an experiential education. What we used to do was things like we did a lesson on natural selection doing musical chairs. Did you know that musical chairs is the most brutal example of natural selection there ever was? We would act out processes with paper and bead models. But we can't do that now because we're online. So an example of what we used to do with Legos, we would divide the kids into 3 groups, give each group the exact same amount of Legos in the same colors and sizes, and ask them to build anything they could think of. And they always came up with different examples. So this is an example of one year where 3 different groups built 3 different structures out of their Legos. But we can't do that now, and to be honest, even if we were in person, we couldn't do that exercise because we simply cannot have students sharing the same things and touching the same things. So now we do these same exercises virtually, and we use things like Google Documents and Jamboard for drawing. So this same Lego exercise we now do with a Google exercise where we can put the kids in Zoom breakout groups. They can share this Google document themselves, and they still have to build using these building blocks, and they can all work on the same document together, and then we will compare what different groups make with the same component of building blocks in the same way that we used to do for Legos. This was an example of isomers and how isomers have the same chemical formula but a different structure, and so it's a way for the kids to visualize this. So students are still getting a visual experience with the material, but I'm going to be honest, it's not kinesthetic. They're not getting to touch it and see it and move it, and that is still somewhat difficult for some of our students, but we're doing the very best we can with the tools we have. So the lessons we have in class. Well, this is a flipped class. Kathy and I both have YouTube channels, and we've made videos to describe most of the content in the class. In those videos, we show pictures, we give a lot of analogies, there's a lot of color. Here's a screenshot from one of my videos talking about transport across the cell membrane. You can see it's very visual, lots of colors. You can always see my picture there in the corner. And so students watch those videos most nights for homework and take notes and submit them to our online Canvas site. During the class, then, we will do interactive lessons that involve more of an expansion of the material they learned the night before in YouTube. We use an interactive format during class, and so this interactive format allows them to write or draw responses right in the middle of the lesson, even though we're online. So here's a screenshot of an example lesson where the students were learning about the different types of fats, which is a macromolecule making up the cell. And in this case, they would have to drag these icons to show me that they understand the difference between a saturated and an unsaturated fat. Students get a copy of these slide decks at the end of the lesson, so there's no pressure to take notes, which can be difficult when we're in an online format. Our labs, well, you all picked up a lab kit, and I'm assuming you all had a petri dish that looked something like this growing on one of the windowsills in your house. We also sent home a microscope, which you haven't opened yet, but when you do, I want to make sure everyone takes very good care of these microscopes. They were very expensive, and we're going to spend quite a lot of time using these. I just couldn't imagine teaching a biology class without having them learn how to use a microscope. So I made the microscope salesperson's day when I called and said, "Hi, I want to buy 82 microscopes." I think she's going to get a very large bonus at the end of the year. So our lab reports, we'll be doing 3 lab reports per semester. We will not be doing posters this year, but we'll likely do 1 or 2 presentations on Flipgrid so that everyone gets to hear about everyone else's findings, especially as we're doing them all individually in our own homes. It would be really great if all the students got to learn what the other students found in their experiments. So the other categories of work we do, we meet twice a week on Zoom. And then there's a third meeting time that is asynchronous, so not together. This asynchronous work is often going to be a new lesson, again using our interactive format where they have to answer questions in the middle of the lesson. It could also be lab work with write-ups, or it could also be some work on test study guides if we're getting ready for a test. In addition to the asynchronous work, there's homework. Most of the time, 90% of the time, the homework will be watching the YouTube videos and taking notes. Oh, I see a typo there. Some of the time, we may actually assign some lab work and write-ups as homework too. So some of the other things involved in the class, there are some semi-weekly quizzes every 2 to 3 weeks. They're very short and they're open note. We will have 2 to 3 midterm tests in the semester. Again, they will be open note. And there'll be no cumulative final exam. There'll simply be a unit test on the last unit, and it will be open note. And engagement will be assessed by completing all the interactive work during in-class lessons. So in a few minutes or a few seconds, this video is going to stop, and it's going to give you the chance to give me some information. The responses will only be visible to me. But what I really want to know are, what are your concerns for this year, if any, and what would you like me to know? So thank you very much for listening. You can contact me anytime at this email address, and I hope you stay well.